So I'd like to hand over to you to start whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Hi, I'm Ben Lawless. I'd firstly just like to thank you all so much for taking half an hour out of what is probably really busy time of the year for you all with this strange, interesting new world of remote learning. I think that memes have been keeping us alive. So I'll just give you a brief introduction about myself. Oh, we've got Nick Aidney in the house. Awesome. He's a good pal of mine, another game maker. So before I became a teacher, I worked at the Assessment Research Centre at Melbourne University under Patrick Griffin. I was a research assistant there for on and off for about 5 or 6 years. In that research centre, they developed, Patrick himself is kind of a bit of a bigwig. He developed this method of developmental thinking around assessment by combining a few different theorists, Glaser, Rasch and Vygotsky. I also teach some of the couple of subjects based on that material at Melbourne University, but to be honest, it took me probably a couple of years to even understand what he meant by developmental thinking, and so hopefully I can do that for you guys within less than half an hour. We'll see how we go. The reason that I'm going to be talking about developmental thinking today is because we're going to show my ideas are based on Patrick's, but you'll also find them in the head of ACER, Jeff Masters, and this really is the direction that education and assessment is going in. I just last night participated in a survey for the new learning progression. The federal government is developing numeracy and literacy learning progressions, which is similar thinking to what I'm going to talk about tonight. But even though educational thinking is moving towards this developmental model, there really isn't that much published material out there. Most teachers that I present to either have to develop the materials from scratch, and so when I had a fateful coffee with Catherine Charles Brown maybe about a year and a half ago, and she suggested getting on board with a textbook. Initially, I wasn't that interested because I was previously been head of faculty of history at my school, and I bought one copy of every single textbook that was going around, and to be honest, they were all pretty much exactly the same thing, and I felt, we don't need another one of the exact same things. These text dense, a lot of them were like university textbook light versions with and they weren't really doing much for the profession. They weren't really pushing forward, and they weren't, there's certainly a view that using textbooks is quite an old-fashioned way of teaching anyway, but I think that's primarily because a lot of the textbook publishers haven't really reacted to the changes in not only the Victorian curriculum, but also the way that thinking around developmental progressions is going. So we came up with an idea to do something completely different, taking the developmental model into consideration, and so that's what I'm going to be having a look at today. Just firstly though, some boring but important things. This session is being recorded. You'll get access to the PowerPoints afterwards, and possibly a screen recording as well. Yep, sweet. Please mute yourself. If you've got any questions, there's a chat box, and if you can type your questions in there as you go, then we'll get someone to read them out, and we'll have a live Q&A session at the end. You can set what view you want. If you go up, you should see at the top of your GoToMeeting thing, there's a click where you can go view everyone, or who's talking, active cameras, or hide everybody. So if you want to just have a different view, get into that. Yep, questions via chat as we mentioned, and we're going to answer them at the end. So the main session will go for about half an hour, and then we'll have about 10-15 minutes of questions at the end. Choice. Okay, just keeping it simple is what we're going to discuss today. I firstly want to talk about developmental thinking. My expertise is, well, my training is in assessment, but my area of passion is in curriculum development. So I was lucky to be able to partner with Matilda to be able to get those two things happening at once. So we're going to talk about developmental thinking to start with. The second thing I want to discuss is the problem with existing materials. Obviously, the biggest problem with existing materials is that they generally do not incorporate developmental thinking into the model of education that they try to provide. And thirdly, we're going to solve the problem with existing materials by talking about the Matilda solution. So what you're going to see towards the end of this presentation are some core textbooks for humanities, flip books. So if you get the hard copy, you get history on one half, and then you flip it halfway around, it's got geography on the other half. They look very fancy. Were sent off to the printers earlier this week. So we've got a year 7, a year 8, and a year 9 one, and that's mapped to the Victorian curriculum. And then we'll have some Q&A at the end. Okay, developmental thinking. So this is the thing where I would normally spend about 8 hours talking about, and we're going to try and give you a brief overview of it in about 10 minutes. So the first point to be made here, which is a really big mindset shift for a lot of people, is the idea that learning is developmental. So, you know, just to give you a really, really oversimplified example, Bloom's taxonomy, for example, if you can't list something, then you can't, if you don't have the skill of being able to list something, then you're not going to be able to describe it. If you don't have the skill of being able to describe it, then you're not necessarily going to be able to explain it. All of these, the lower level skills are enabling to higher level skills. And if the materials that you present to your students aren't presented in order from easier to harder, if they're just thrown at them and you haven't sort of mapped out what difficulty they are, then students are going to be all over the place. I've seen research that suggests that the average student, 80% of what comes across their desk is at the wrong difficulty. It's either too easy or too hard. So the shift towards developmental thinking, we believe, is, I wouldn't necessarily say that it saves you lots of time. I think the point is that the time that you do spend teaching is much more effective. It's much more targeted. So the typical model that you hear about, you'll often hear people talking about gaps in learning. Yeah, when you hear people saying, "Oh yeah, they've got this gap in their learning," that is essentially having the deficit model. So the deficit model, the deficit model is in contrast to the developmental model. Yeah, the developmental model says you learn this, and that enables you to learn this, enables you to learn this, enables you to learn this. So that's Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. Once you find out what a student's ability is, then you can target your instruction at that level, and it's going to be way more effective than if you just throw random stuff at them and hope it hits. So just to give you a little visual example of the deficit model, say for example you've got 3 skills here: skill A, skill B, and skill C. Yeah. So say for example at the point, let's see if this pointer works. Here we go. You guys see that laser pointer? Awesome. Okay, so say for example, cool, you know all of that skill. The deficit model would say, yes, you got that bit, you got that bit. Oh, you went overseas, or there was a global pandemic and you didn't learn that skill, but then you continued learning. And the idea behind the deficit model is that the teacher can just go back and fix these little gaps in knowledge, right? Now, perhaps for content knowledge, where it's not developmental, it's just discrete packets of information, then that might be true that you can go back and fix those gaps. But if the research is to be believed, and I think it is, that learning is developmental, then what you're going to find is that after these gaps occur, there isn't actually much learning that happens afterwards. So rather than thinking that there's just little gaps you can go in and fix, these skills are all enabling skills. If I don't have this skill here, I'm not going to be able to learn these two. Yeah, so that's what. And so after these so-called gaps occur, there's not much learning that happens here at all. So a teacher's job shouldn't be to try and figure out what the gaps are, quote unquote. The job of the teacher is to figure out, or one of the many jobs of a teacher, is to figure out what the student's current ability is, and then teach them from that point. Even though education is quite an interesting industry in the sense that the research has demonstrated that learning is developmental, and we've known this for well over a decade, and Jeff Masters has been preaching it from the hilltops. ever since he became the head of ACR, and yet this information hasn't necessarily filtered down to the classroom level that much, I don't think. You often still hear teachers talking about fixing gaps. Okay. So another thing, and this is the title of Patrick's book, Assessment is for Teaching. I don't know if any of you guys were there at my HTAV keynote, but I'll repeat the same joke I made then. The Department of Education, and admittedly they did get rid of this last year, the Department of Education used to say assessment is of, as, and for learning. And I was joking there that, you know, obviously the department was given a whole heap of prepositions for Christmas and just started adding, you know, assessment is under teaching, on teaching. What Patrick's point is that assessment is for teaching. So, sorry, the department said assessment is as learning, for learning. The developmental thinking would suggest that what you should use assessment evidence for is to inform your teaching, to find out where students are and then to target your teaching at that. The zone of proximal development is a very unsexy way. I heard one presenter, James Anderson, call it the Goldilocks zone. Yeah, so not too hard, not too easy, just right. So assessment is designed to find out what your students currently know, not just what they know, but what their current skill level is, and then you teach them from that point. Yeah. Something that's really common in education and quite unfortunate is that assessment in most other industries is used for information. Assessment in education historically has been used as judgment. You're a D student, that's bad. You're an A student, that's great. Rather than looking at the progress that a student might be making or whatever. And it also, in most published curriculums, it also inappropriately compares students to age-based norms, assuming that everybody, all humans that were manufactured in the year 2008 and who are therefore 12 should have these skills and abilities. And anybody who's taught for more than 5 seconds knows that there's a huge gap of ability within the average class. When you get up to the year 12 level, you're kind of looking at sometimes up to 7 years gap. So some of those students would be at home in the second year uni course and some would be struggling in year 8. So the idea that all students, that this whole norm referencing that all of the curriculums are based around isn't necessarily ground in developmental thinking principles. So as mentioned, the purpose of assessment is to determine the zone of proximal development, or that Goldilocks zone. Assessment also reflects teacher effectiveness. Yeah. So you've all heard the joke about, oh, well, I taught really well, but the students just didn't learn it. I think it's some Scandinavian country, they don't have a word for teaching and learning, it's just the same word. The way I kind of see it, we don't teach, we help others to learn something. I guess, we expose them to experiences so that they learn. If there's no learning going on, then there's no teaching going on. So assessment evidence in the developmental model reflects teacher effectiveness. This is something that Hattie talks about a lot, know thy impact, and you get that through assessment evidence. Okay. So developmental models compare students to criteria, not age-based norms. This is something quite big in the Matilda book, which I'll show you a progression of quite soon. The progression of skills in the Year 7 book, for example, the lowest level skill is something that you would probably expect a typical grade 5 or grade 6 student to be able to do. And the hardest thing is something that's probably more at a Year 9 level. And that's much more realistic to the spread of ability that you see in a typical classroom. Differentiation should be by ability. I've been to quite a few, I always go to differentiation PDs just to hear the interesting things that people say. People talk about differentiation, you should do visual, kinesthetic, audio, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I guess that is all now called differentiation. But to my mind and for the developmental model, the only differentiation should be by ability. That's by far the most effective form of differentiation. You should definitely teach in lots of different modes just to be interesting, but in terms of what's most effective form of differentiation is differentiating by ability. giving students different work based on their current level of skill in whatever task. Developmental model also squares with the growth mindset. This is something that I harp on to my students about constantly. You know, anytime some student tells me that they can't do something, I say, is that right? You didn't used to be able to walk. You didn't used to be able to hold a spoon, but now you can. Okay, so the developmental mindset and the learning ladders in the Matilda books, essentially everyone is on that ladder and everybody's just slowly climbing up the ladder. And the idea behind the ladder is that the developmental model tries to be non-judgmental. It just says everybody is on a path of development. Some people are on a higher rung on that skill, some people on a higher rung on the other skill. There's no point judging anybody. You should just compare yourself to yourself at an earlier point in time. Just briefly, a few benefits for stakeholders of the developmental thinking model. We had brought in developmental rubrics in the school that I teach at about 3 or 4 years ago, and we've seen huge improvement in student motivation, particularly students at the higher and lower levels. If you remember back to what I was saying about the fact that students, some research suggests that 80% of what students see is either too hard or too easy. If it's too hard, students, you know, they're working their butts off and not getting much reward, and they're still getting D's, so they get demotivated. Equally, students at the top level, they might find it really easy to do the stuff that's targeted at the age appropriate level, and so they coast. And if you look at the NAPLAN data divided up into ability quartiles, you find that Australian students, the top quartile of Australian students are actually making the least growth. Yeah, teacher time is finite, and the government says get everybody up to this age norm, and once they're at that age norm, oh, they'll be fine. Yeah, so students who make the least amount of progress in Australian schools are those at the top end, because they haven't been, because there's not a developmental model thinking behind the education that they receive. If you think about it from the deficit point of view, a student who's already above the age level norm has no deficits, so they can be left to their own devices. Maybe you'll give them the textbook from the year above, and then you'll spend the limited amount of time that you've got on students at the lower end. And the students at the lower end make the most growth in Australian schools. So for teachers, teacher time. Now, when we originally moved to developmental models of rubrics, we mistakenly told teachers that it would save them heaps of time. It makes the time that you do spend much more effective. The NAPLAN results at our school have literally gone developmental model of rubrics, boom, we've seen a massive jump in just like 2 years. What's great about the Matilda publication that you're going to see is that we've done all of the mapping for you. So actually, if you were using this resource, it probably would be more time effective, because the reason why ours wasn't is because we had to develop all of this material ourselves from scratch. And finally, parents get more information. Parents get information saying what a student can do and what they need to do to get better, rather than comparing them against other students in their class or judging them. And parents benefit from seeing their students being more motivated. We got huge amount of positive parent feedback from the kind of stuff that we've been doing. Okay, the problem with existing materials. They aren't research-based, so we don't see any developmental principles underpinning a lot of the work in other textbooks. Now, I'm not a world's expert on every single textbook that's available in Victorian curriculum, but the ones that I have seen, I would say definitely don't fit into the developmental model. There's the problem of difficulty, as mentioned. Up to 80% of what students see is either too difficult or too easy. And if you have a look at the questions that are asked of students in typical textbooks, it's usually just, if you think from a Bloom's point of view, it's usually just a whole heap of lower order regurgitate information back to me type questions. If there are skill-based questions, and some of the textbooks have started asking skill-based questions and historical thinking concept-based questions, but they're not mapped to a progression, and so there's no way for students to get better by answering harder and harder questions. So even if there are questions that tests that develop a skill or look at a historical thinking concept. There's no, the teacher and the student doesn't get any idea of which ones are more difficult and which you should do to get better. Extension material is either non-existent or hard to access. A lot of the time that extension material is online only material. In the Matilda stuff, you're going to see we've got that embedded in the book itself. But I think this is a really big point. There's no clear mapping. So you might find links to the curriculum in textbooks, or at least in the teacher version of them, but there's no clear mapping of the difficulty of the different skills being covered. And it's not obvious that questions get more difficult and that questions are targeted at higher levels of skills, if that makes sense. The curriculum isn't mapped correctly either. If you have a look at what the changes that have happened in the Victorian curriculum over the last 5-10 years, there's been a huge change away from, so historically, now this talk is mostly based on history because that's the part of the book that I worked on. The entire series, all of it has developmental principles. I'm just speaking about the bit that I know the most about. If you have a look at the Victorian curriculum, and this is true for all the humanities, historically humanities education was highly content focused. Now, if you have a look at the achievement standards, it's roughly 50% content, 50% skills. And actually, if you look at just the pure word count, there's more time spent on skills than on content. And yet most published texts are very heavy on content. If they do have skills questions, okay, but they don't actually teach those skills. They might just ask you questions and assume that you're randomly going to learn those skills through osmosis. That's something that I think that a lot of teachers can sometimes do, is assess students and ask students to do things that they don't explicitly teach them. Right on. So let's get on to the good stuff. The Matilda solution. So now the books, the year 7, 8 and 9 books are flip books. They've got history in the first half, geography in the second half. Economics and business and civics and citizenship are integrated into these sections. Peter Van Norden, who, I don't know if you know the guy, but he's my idol. He has been really clever at integrating economics and business and civics and citizenship skills and content knowledge into the history and geography content that you see in the books. I know each school unpacks the humanities curriculum in various different ways. I would say that the majority of the teachers that I speak to spend more time on history and geography than they do on economics and business and civics and citizenship. Yeah, Peter's been very clever at being able to integrate those other two aspects into the history and geography halves of the flip book. So this is what underpins our entire book, and there's one of these for the geography skills as well. So we looked at the 5 main skills that are in the Victorian curriculum: chronology, source analysis, continuity and change, cause and effect, and historical significance. And then we put here are the lowest level of skill for each of those, the lowest criteria for each of those skills. Here are the top ones, and then all of the ones in the middle. So the idea is that and this is, if anyone's ever heard me go on about rubrics before, the idea is that the skills at the bottom level should be something that every student in your class is able to do. The things at the top should be something that are a stretch even for your top students. So if any of you guys are teaching year 7 history at the moment, have a look there and think, yeah, I mean, just looking at that, I would definitely say that these things would be a stretch even for my top year 7 students. But remember, those top students are the ones that are making the least progress. And what's great about this progression is that actually what we've found when we introduce rubrics like this at my school is that even having that in itself is a piece of curriculum that highlights to students. So especially middle and high ability students, they've never seen what it looks like to get better. They've just been told, yeah, you got an A, you got an A+, you're fantastic. They've never been shown what it looks like to get better because they were already meeting the age-based norms. In this developmental progression, this is laid out really nicely in the book as a learning ladder. And this essentially is the domain of all the different skills in the Victorian curriculum. There are two other things that we included as well. I think that in terms of transferable skills, I personally believe the two most important things that you get out of history education at school is the ability to write and do research. So written communication and research is, really, really transferable, not just to other areas of education, but also life in general. And so we've made these go from left to right because rather than being developmental, these are stages in a process, okay? And so not only do we ask questions targeted at all these different levels on this learning ladder, we also give students activities to develop their skills at the different stages of the process. A lot of published texts will just go, do a research project on Pericles, rather than actually laying out what the research process is, or write a short essay on blah blah, without actually teaching the students what the stages in the writing process are. So here's what the learning ladder looks like in the year. So the shots that you're going to see, screenshots you're going to see, are all from the Ancient Greece chapter of our Year 7 book. So this is the learning ladder. When they first sent the proofs to me, I got confused as to why there was a giant bit of gap here, but that's because that's where the page, that's where the spine is. So anyway, so here's the learning ladder. If you have a look here in bold, that's all the stuff from the progression that I showed you. Each chapter fleshes it out a bit more and says what it would look like when applied to ancient Greece. So I can read a timeline. What does that mean for ancient Greece? I can read timelines with ancient Greek events on them and answer questions about them. And we try really, really hard to write all of this stuff in the learning ladder in student-friendly language. We're going to go through and have a look at one skill in particular and show you how it's mapped throughout the chapter. So, and the skill is cause and effect, I believe. Yep, okay. So here's a chapter on why did the ancient Greeks become seafarers, and you have a look here, cause and effect. Let's have a look here. So students are asked questions at the 4 different steps. So instantly the students know the difficulty of those 4 different questions. The question, step 1 is targeted at the lowest level, step 2 is targeted at the second lowest level, and so on. Step 5, when they get to the end of the chapter, there's a masterclass and they're asked questions at that higher level. You'll also note that at the bottom of each question set, it tells you if you want to learn how to do the skill of cause and effect, go to page 215. I'll show you that in a second. I think that's probably the thing I'm most proud of ever having written in my life, is that history how-to section. So later on, now what I want to point out is that students aren't going to develop those skills just by answering that one question. They need to do it a number of times. It's what in high impact teaching strategies they call multiple exposures, which is just doing the same thing more than once. So in chapter 3.2, they do it. Again, in chapter 3.9, they do it. There's more questions about cause and effect right there at the 4 different levels. And again, if I want to know how to do those things, I can go to page 215. And then at the end of each chapter, we have a masterclass. So what the masterclass does is that it asks a whole series of questions, but it will give you, so if you have a look here, step 1, this is from all 5 skills in our progression, all at level 1, essentially step 1, that's the lowest difficulty, yeah? And then here, we've got all questions about ancient Greek history at level 2 difficulty. So there's a million different ways that teachers could use this in the classroom. They could set students, they could start them at different steps. Students could self-evaluate and decide to start at a different step, whatever. As always, I'm going over time here. And again, right up, and then at step 5, they get to, and then they have to do it. So in the masterclass, that's when they start on the hardest, the highest level stuff, the step 5 stuff. So you could say, I want you to go to page 126. I want you to do all the step 4 stuff, because you're like at step 4. And then there's also a little activity for students to do some historical writing and historical research. And a really cool thing that's been added to the book is this capstone project where you put all of your skills and knowledge together and complete a capstone task there. And if you scan that QR code, eventually that'll take you to it online. I just want to quickly show you the history how-to section. So this here, what I think has been lacking in a lot of published text is that they'll ask you questions asking you about historical skills, but they don't explicitly teach them. So in the history how-to section, which is in the middle of the book, there's just a little blurb about what cause and effect means, and then each step has an explanation and a worked example for every single step. So this is just the cause and effect one again. So here's step 1, here's some worked examples, here's step 2, determining cause and effects, here's step 3, explaining why something is cause and effect, and here are all the examples, worked examples there. And again, there, how to analyze, how to evaluate. What I found is that when we started trying to teach students, especially at the higher ability levels, students have never been taught even what the word analyze means. And a lot of educators have a lot of different beliefs about what it means, but in education, analysis does have a definition. I don't know if you can see it there. Analyzing means the ability to break down something into its parts. And so we give students, we explain what the skill means and a worked example of how to do it. Just briefly, our wonderful head of content, Catherine, has demonstrated here that this is the achievement standard for year 7-8 history, and this is where you find all of that stuff in the Matilda book. Something Olive loves is the high impact teaching strategies, the HITS. So how does this one published text go for this? Structuring lessons, for sure. We map out all of the different ability levels. Is there explicit teaching? Yes, in that history how-to section, we explicitly teach all of the skills at the different levels rather than just having a blanket statement about what cause and effect is. We say what analysing cause and effect is, what evaluating causes and effects is like. Do we have worked examples? Yes, we do. I worked very hard to produce some worked examples there. Multiple exposures. Yep, if you went through the whole of one chapter, you would be exposed to, say, for example, cause and effect. You would do, there's 2 or 3, I think it might be 2. Is it 2, Catherine? Yep. So students would do activities at step 1, 2, 3, and 4 for cause and effect twice, and then again in the masterclass. So just doing one whole chapter, say doing the ancient Greece chapter, students would do cause and effect activities at all levels 3 times. Are there metacognitive strategies? Yes. In the history how-to section at the end, it talks about the highest level stuff is metacognitive, and also there's evaluation of your writing and evaluation of your research at the highest level in the history how-to section. We teach students to ask questions, and hopefully you should find most teachers are able to give much more detailed feedback from you doing the activities in that book. And is it differentiated? Well, I think that's the number one of the hugest selling points of the book is that it self-differentiates. You can have students do each ability level, or you can target them. So how Matilda solves those common problems, just to go back to what the problems were. We said that a lot of texts aren't research-based. Matilda's are based on developmental principles. There's that problem of difficulty. We solve that by having a clear progression of 5 different levels, and the extension material is easy to access. It's in the book itself. You don't have to go away to some website to find it. And often there's no clear mapping in typical texts. We solve that by having a learning ladder, which maps out the difficulty of the different skills. But also, we focus on content and skills, just like you see in the curriculum. Yeah, there's been quite a big shift from content to skills, and Matilda's book, Good Humanities, does really well at that new change. Right, so there's the covers of the books, 7, 8, and 9. Now I think it's going to be time for some questions, is it? What have we got here? Someone going to read those questions out to me? Oh, I can probably just check them in the chat myself, can we?
Yeah, so there's one from Nathan, Ben. Would some type of diagnostic test be possible at the beginning of a unit or area to gauge what step students are at already?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. That is something that we've thought of, and it's possibly something that we're going to be able to develop in the digital materials at a later date. Currently, what we would say is that even students who are at, say, naturally at step 3, you know, if you believe all the research around multiple exposures, students who are doing higher ability stuff should probably still be exposed to that lower level stuff. It's kind of like, this is a weird analogy, but when I used to do karate and I was a white belt, they used to have black belts in there with us, and they were just teaching us just to do simple punches, and the black belts would still learn to do the really simple stuff, but they would just do it at like a ridiculously high level. So that is something that we toyed with, and it's something that we're possibly going to come back to at some point. Essentially, I would probably surmise that most teachers, when they look at that learning ladder, would, you know, and if they've taught their students at all, probably be able to position them on that ladder. You probably find once the students start answering questions that you'll know which questions they're answering successfully, which ones they're not, and then you'll go, oh yeah, that student's at level 2 at that skill, level 3 at that skill, and so on. I hope that answers that question. No, that's not a perfect answer. What's the next one here? We've got one from Nathan. What do you suggest for students working beyond the expected year level, say year 8 working a year 9 level? Yeah, good question. So if you, that's from Nathan Wood Davies. He's asking, what do you do about students working beyond the expected level? In our learning ladder, and I don't want to go back too far, because oh, hang on, we've got one on the next slide. This learning ladder here, we would say that this here probably accounts for quite a lot of different, like this here, I can read a timeline. That's possibly a year 5, year 6 kind of skill, ability. I can describing patterns of change. That would probably be more like what you'd see a typical year 9 doing anyway. So our learning ladders have a much bigger spread of skills. So even just in that one there, I'd say you're looking at roughly an average grade 5 up to a grade 9. That's 5 year levels within the one learning progression. Cara asks, would you get the kids to pick their own steps with your guidance? I definitely would, yes. When I've trialed stuff like that before, and I was actually quite concerned that students would you know, when I was new to teaching, had this assumption that everybody does, that kids are lazy and they would just purposely pick the easiest thing they could. There's a thing in educational psychology, which a lot of you probably know about, called flow, and that's the idea that the ability of the student matches the difficulty of the task that they're doing. When students get into flow, time ceases to exist. They really enjoy themselves. This is when students will go above and beyond and start doing all kinds of tasks and do homework when you didn't even ask them to. What I found when students pick their own difficulty is that they do actually, you know, if you look at Hattie's effect sizes, one of the highest effect sizes is students' own beliefs about their own ability level. Students know what ability level they've got. You know, you could probably show that learning ladder to most students, and I would be willing to guess that a lot of them would know just by reading those statements what their level is. It's a really good question. Sharon asked, this is awesome, is there an equivalent textbook that works with the developmental model for the subject English? I think that could be, I think there's a new task for the team at Matilda to get onto, make an English textbook with these developmental principles. But the federal government are currently developing progressions for literacy and numeracy. However, it's a federal government, so they're going at the speed of a sloth after having taken too much heroin. So I wouldn't hold your breath. You know, they've been at the planning stage for that progression that progression project for about 5 or 6 years. Yes, as Matilda Education said, watch this space. Yeah, good call. What kind of features to be offered in the online version? Would one of the Matilda staff like to answer that?
Yeah, Nathan, good question. There's a lot of digital that we have, and we're going to be sending a sample out of that to for everybody to link up and have a look at an interactive copy of the book. There's going to be videos, downloadable and editable worksheets, so you can actually make them your own and change them up if you want to do some extensive differentiation. There's auto-correcting quizzes where students get feedback and can see where they've answered incorrectly and be able to get the correct answer. There's answers for teachers, so good news there. We've got you covered. Lots of web links, some fantastic web links. The learning ladder is interactive, and that links to the skills where a student can be at a level 2, at step 2, and they want to get to a step 3. They can click on that link and get to the skill to further improve their skills. There's also rubrics, comprehensive teaching programs. Our teaching program looks fantastic, and I'm sure you'll be very happy with that. Audio support, which is something quite different in textbooks, and other downloadable resources. So I think that pretty much covers it.
Cara just asked, would these online things work with Google Classroom or other delivery methods? I don't know anything about Google Classroom. Our school's very conservative about what we use. Or Schoolbox, good question. Matilda, any answers there?
I'm not quite sure, Cara, what you actually mean. So you can, I don't know if you can unmute yourself and extend on that question.
Hey. A lot of hey Ben, a lot of schools are using things like MS Teams, Schoolbox, Seesaw, Google Classrooms, all of that sort of stuff. Would some of these downloadable things, your worksheets and your auto-correcting quizzes, would they be easily enough, to be able to throw into like a Google Classroom or a Schoolbox or an MS Teams situation? You'd be able to flick them over pretty easily, couldn't you?
Yeah, I know from having used the auto-correcting quizzes with another textbook that they're really awesome for remote learning. I've for the last month, I've been doing all my homework through, and I don't have to bother correcting it. I just check to see if students have done it or not. Yeah,
exactly. What I was thinking about the online stuff. Yeah, yep.
Yeah, it's interesting how much more switched on and interested people are getting into this kind of like, let's let technology do some of the low level stuff for us. Rachel asked, do all of the textbooks have skill ladders 2 years higher for differentiation? So the Victorian curriculum was originally divided up into bands, 2-year bands. 7, 8 was one band, and then 9, 10 was one band. I think the Victorian curriculum also has the same difficulty skills for 7 and 8. So the learning ladder for 7 and 8 is the same, but the year 9 one is more difficult. Yeah. So the year 9, if you have a look at the year 9 learning ladder in our textbooks, it does have, I would say that it goes 2 years higher for differentiation. Yeah. Good question.
Yeah. I will also add that a lot of these resources are downloadable, so you will be able to upload them into your LMS, your learning management system, Schoolbox, whatever you're using there. So you can save the file for whatever that system requires.
Awesome. Right. Here's a slide about next steps. Oh, I tried to be clever and put a capital P there. So you want to, Katrina, you want to talk about that one?
I just probably, firstly, wanted to thank you, Ben. It's been a fantastic session, and I'm sure everybody's got a lot out of it. I certainly have, and I look forward to more of these to come. We're going to send out PowerPoints to everybody who participated today, so look out for that. We'll also, I'll send you an email, so make sure you keep an eye out for this one, on selecting your free complimentary book for attending this session. That is capped at 1 book per school, and for secondary practicing teachers. So keep an eye out for that. We'll also send out an interactive sample. So we've spoken a little bit about the digital today and the things that it can do. We're going to send you a link out so you'll be able to actually experience that and have a play for yourself and have a really good look at the content, because it's beautiful and engaging and obviously very topical at the moment. And you'll be able to have a look at the learning ladder too. So that will give you a better indication of what we've been talking about here today. Our aim is also to run some more webinars on different topics. So if you do have anything that you have in mind or you'd like to hear about, please do send us an email and let us know, and we'll try to address those. I'm here for face-to-face or virtual meetings, depending on what time of the year it is. And, you know, you can contact me at any time, so you can see my details down the bottom there. And I think we've just got a few more questions, Ben, when I've been talking, so I don't know if you have time to look over them.
Yeah. We're trying to answer them in text, but okay. So that's just someone asking me about doing PD on developmental model. Yes, I've done that a few times. If you contact Matilda, they can put you in touch with me. Someone just asked, will the textbooks be for each subject or have history and geography in one textbook? They are in one textbook. So I'd never heard of this before Catherine showed me. It's a flip book. So one book will be history, and then it goes history up till the middle, where there's the history how-to, and then you flip the book over, and then there's the geography half. Remember that the economics and business and the civics and citizenship stuff is integrated into the history and geography halves of the book. So the whole book, it flips over. So the second half of the book, the pages are upside down, if that makes sense. So it looks like it's got two covers. Very snazzy. And yeah, do it. And there you go, just to prove that there's research backing up what I was talking about.
Yeah, good.
Right on. Does anyone have any questions they want to unmute themselves and ask any questions face to face? Good to see you all there.
And the other thing, before we all do disappear, I'd like to thank everybody for coming and participating in this event. It's fantastic. I know you're all very busy and time poor at the moment. So congratulations for joining us, and I hope you all got something out of it. Yay, I'll clap to that. Well done, Ben. Fantastic.
Teachers rule the world.
Oh, look at that. Everybody's clapping. I love it.
Let's naively hope that this home learning experience has meant that parents and the general public are going to have a greater appreciation for teachers. I'm not holding my breath, but you never know. Make sure you get your free resource. Yeah, hot off the press right now. I want to get my hands on one.
Thanks, Ben. I miss the green hair though.
But still, it's been washing out. Yeah, so, no, I kid you not, when Dan Andrews said we're closing the schools down, that night I went and dyed my hair green, and it's just slowly come out. Because I can't have it extreme face to face, apparently. So you can't, obviously you can't tell how green it is. That's good. I'm dyeing it purple before we go back, but because some of our counsellors have got purple hair, so all the female staff have got really wacky coloured hair. None of the male staff dye their hair, so I'm just going to have to plead sexism if they tell me off for it.
Yeah, no, do it. The kids will love it.
Yeah.
The other thing to note for your free books too is that the published dates are July for the Year 7 book, and we've got August and October for 8 and 9. So it's a 7 to 9 series, and they're coming out this year. They're about to go to the printers, so we're all very excited.
Oh yeah, hang on.
Playing 3 Year 10 one at the moment.
Here's the date that they're out. You see that? Boom. July, August, October. So they'll all be available for 2021 book listing.
Any plans for a Year 10 one?
Good question. I think the thinking was that a lot of schools, Year 10, a lot of schools don't actually make humanities compulsory in Year 10, and a lot of them go quite broad in terms of what topics they do. It's certainly been something that's been discussed. Catherine's unmuted herself. She'll have a much better idea of it than I do.
Yeah,
there any-
Cara, it's a good question. It is something we've discussed a lot, and we just want to make sure we get our model right for that very different year that Year 10 is. It's a pre-senior year. It breaks off into a lot of different electives, so watch this space.
Thanks heaps. See ya.
Thanks, Cara. Thanks, everyone.
I think I'll have to stop doing whole day PDs. I was able to explain everything that I know in 20 minutes. That was sweet.
And that was fantastic. Thank you. I learn something new from you every time you talk about this stuff.